When Canada, America's closest ally, sharing the world's longest undefended border, economically integrated for over a century, announces a $500 billion investment strategy explicitly designed to reduce export dependence on the United States from 75% to 60%, that's not routine trade policy. That's a vote of no confidence. When Germany debates replacing American nuclear weapons stationed on its soil with French ones, when Japan quietly builds offensive military capabilities that violate its pacifist constitution, when South Korea discusses developing its own nuclear arsenal. These aren't isolated decisions made in vacuum. They're symptoms of the same diagnosis. America's allies no longer trust American reliability, and they're building escape plans accordingly. This isn't about hostility toward America. These nations remain formally allied through NATO, bilateral treaties, and security partnerships. But there's a crucial distinction between alliance on paper and trust in practice. You can have treaties without trust. And increasingly, that's exactly what characterizes America's relationships with its traditional partners. Formal commitments maintained while actual reliance is systematically reduced. To understand how we arrived here, we need to examine the historical foundation of trust that these alliances were built upon, and the specific moments when that trust began eroding. The post-World War II alliance system rested on a simple premise. America would provide security guarantees, and allies would align their foreign policies accordingly and host American military bases. This wasn't altruism. It served American interests by creating a network of partnerships that contained Soviet expansion and maintained global stability favorable to American economic interests. But it worked because American commitments were credible. When America said it would defend Western Europe or Japan or South Korea, allies believed it. This credibility was tested and validated multiple times. During the Berlin airlift in 1948-49, America demonstrated it would take significant risks to defend allies. During the Korean War, America committed hundreds of thousands of troops to defend South Korea. The Cuban Missile Crisis showed American willingness to risk nuclear war over threats to the Western Hemisphere. These actions built trust, the belief that American commitments meant something real. But the foundation of trust also contained an assumption that would prove problematic. Allies assumed American foreign policy would be relatively consistent across administrations. Democrats and Republicans might disagree on domestic policy, but on fundamental questions of alliance commitments and global engagement, there was bipartisan consensus. NATO was sacrosanct. The U.S.-Japan alliance was unquestioned. South Korea could count on the American security umbrella. This consensus held for decades, creating predictability that allies could base their own security planning on. The first major crack appeared not from policy change, but from American unilateralism. The 1956 Suez Crisis provided the template. Britain and France, along with Israel, invaded Egypt to retake control of the Suez Canal after Nasser nationalized it. The operation was militarily successful, but the Eisenhower administration, furious at not being consulted and concerned about Soviet response and Middle Eastern reaction, forced Britain and France to withdraw by threatening their currencies and blocking IMF support. The lesson European allies learned wasn't about the specific merits of the Suez operation. It was that America would prioritize its own judgment over allied interests even when those allies had vital stakes involved. Britain and France had colonial interests and economic dependencies that made Suez crucial to them. America dismissed these concerns and forced compliance. The humiliation was comprehensive. Britain's Prime Minister Anthony Eden resigned in disgrace. European leaders drew conclusions. If America would abandon allies over Suez when the stakes were relatively low for the U.S. but existential for European powers, what would America do in a real crisis? This planted seeds of doubt about American reliability that would germinate over decades. The 1973 Yom Kippur War taught Israel similar lessons about American reliability, or rather, about its limits. When Egypt and Syria launched surprise attacks on Israel, The Nixon administration initially hesitated to provide military support. Kissinger was pursuing détente with the Soviet Union and didn't want Middle East conflicts disrupting that effort. Only when Israeli forces began suffering serious losses and the possibility of Israeli defeat became real did America initiate a massive airlift of weapons and supplies. Israel survived and won the war, but Israeli leaders learned that American support, while ultimately forthcoming, could not be assumed automatic or immediate. This drove Israel's determination to develop independent military capabilities that could guarantee survival even if American support was delayed or denied. Israel's nuclear weapons program, its domestic defense industry, its military self-sufficiency, all reflect lessons from 1973 about the dangers of complete dependence on American security guarantees. The 2003 Iraq War created a different kind of trust problem. Major European allies, France and Germany prominently, opposed the invasion, arguing correctly that the intelligence about weapons of mass destruction was questionable and that the war would destabilize the region. The Bush administration dismissed these concerns, invaded anyway, and the predicted problems materialized. No WMDs were found. Iraq descended into sectarian civil war. Regional instability spread. The lesson wasn't just that America made a catastrophic mistake. It was that America could make a catastrophic mistake, despite warnings from experienced allies, drag those allies into dealing with the consequences, and never face accountability for the disaster. Germany and France were proven right. Their warnings were ignored. The cleanup fell partially on them through refugee flows and regional instability. And American foreign policy continued largely unchanged. This taught European allies that American decision-making could be fundamentally flawed even on existential security questions. And that alliance did not mean American leadership would listen to allied perspectives. If America could ignore Europe on something as consequential as the Iraq War, alliance meant less than Europeans had assumed. But the real acceleration of Allied hedging, the systematic building of alternatives to American reliability, began in the 2010s and exploded after 2016. The Trump administration's explicit questioning of NATO commitments, threats to withdraw from the alliance, descriptions of allies as freeloaders, and transactional approach to security relationships shattered the assumption of American consistency. Trump's statement that he would only defend NATO allies who met defense spending targets was particularly damaging. The entire logic of NATO Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all, rests on the commitment being unconditional. If defense of allies becomes conditional on meeting spending targets or other criteria, Article 5 is meaningless. European allies understood this immediately. Germany's response has been multifaceted. On one level, Germany increased defense spending as Trump demanded, moving toward the 2% of GDP NATO target. But simultaneously, Germany began developing alternatives to American security dependence. The Franco-German defense cooperation intensified. Discussions began about European strategic autonomy, the ability of Europe to defend itself without American involvement. The nuclear question became particularly sensitive. Germany hosts American nuclear weapons as part of NATO nuclear sharing. But if America's commitment to defend Germany is uncertain, are American nuclear weapons on German soil an asset or a liability? Some German politicians began asking whether France, which has its own independent nuclear deterrent, might extend nuclear guarantees to Germany, replacing American weapons with French protection. This represented a revolutionary shift. For decades, the American nuclear umbrella over Europe was unquestioned. Now Germany, the anchor of the European alliance, was openly discussing alternatives. The fact that these discussions were happening at all demonstrated how fundamentally trust had eroded. France's approach under Macron has been even more explicit. Macron declared NATO brain dead in 2019, arguing that the alliance had lost strategic purpose and that Europe couldn't rely on American protection. France advocated for a European army, independent European defense capabilities, and strategic autonomy from American decision-making. This wasn't anti-American rhetoric. It was French acknowledgement that European security could no longer depend primarily on American guarantees. Japan's response has been quieter but equally significant. Japan's post-World War II constitution, imposed by the United States, includes Article 9, which renounces war and prohibits maintenance of military forces beyond self-defense. For decades, Japan maintained only a self-defense force and relied completely on the American security umbrella, particularly against China and North Korea. But as American commitment became questionable, Trump demanded Japan pay more for American bases, suggested Japan should acquire its own nuclear weapons, complained about trade imbalances. Japan began reinterpreting its constitution to allow offensive military capabilities. Japan now develops missiles that can strike enemy territory, aircraft carriers that can project power beyond Japanese waters, and military cooperation with partners beyond the U.S.-Japan alliance. This doesn't mean Japan is abandoning the American alliance. It means Japan is building capabilities so that if American support proves unreliable, Japan can defend itself independently. The quiet revolution in Japanese defense policy reflects profound uncertainty about American commitments. South Korea faces even more acute challenges. North Korea possesses nuclear weapons and missiles capable of hitting South Korea and Japan. For decades, South Korea relied on the American nuclear umbrella to deter North Korean aggression. But Trump's willingness to meet with Kim Jong-un without consulting South Korea, his statements about withdrawing American troops, and his demands for massive increases in South Korean payments for American bases created existential anxiety. South Korean response has included serious domestic discussion about developing independent nuclear weapons. While South Korea hasn't pursued this option yet, it would violate non-proliferation treaties and create tensions with America and China. The fact that mainstream South Korean politicians openly discuss it shows how dramatically trust has shifted. South Korea is considering the previously unthinkable because relying completely on American protection no longer seems prudent. Canada's $500 billion diversification strategy represents perhaps the most significant indicator because Canada has been America's most reliable ally and most integrated partner. The Canadian economy is deeply intertwined with America's. Cultural ties are extensive. The border is undefended. The security relationship has been seamless. If any ally should feel confident in American reliability, it would be Canada. But Canada under Prime Minister Carney explicitly designed economic policy to reduce dependence on the American market from 75% of exports to below 60% within a decade. This isn't about finding new trading partners for marginal goods. It's about fundamentally reorienting the Canadian economy to reduce vulnerability to American policy unpredictability. The trigger was American tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, tariffs imposed on specious national security grounds against America's closest ally. If America would impose tariffs on Canada citing national security, no economic relationship with America could be considered secure. Canadian planners concluded that dependence on the American market created unacceptable risk. The Canadian strategy involves diversifying export markets toward Asia, Europe, and Latin America, building domestic supply chains that don't depend on American inputs, developing independent capabilities in sectors currently dominated by American suppliers, creating alternatives to American investment in Canadian development projects. The scale, $500 billion over 5 years, demonstrates how seriously Canada takes the project of reducing American dependence. If Canada, sharing geography, culture, language, history, and deep economic integration, feels compelled to build systematic alternatives to American reliability, that sends a message to every other ally. If even Canada doesn't trust American consistency, who should? Australia presents an interesting case because it's simultaneously deepening military cooperation with America through AUKUS, while also maintaining massive economic ties with China. This seemingly contradictory approach actually reflects sophisticated hedging. Australia needs American security guarantees against potential Chinese coercion. But Australia also can't afford to sever economic ties with China, its largest trading partner. The Australian solution is to maintain security relationships with America while pursuing economic interests with China, accepting the tension this creates. Australia won't choose between America and China because choosing either exclusively would create unacceptable vulnerability. Instead, Australia hedges security with America, economics with China, and independent capabilities developed, so Australia isn't completely dependent on either. Israel's approach has always involved hedging despite the U.S.-Israel special relationship. Israel maintains the qualitative military edge through American weapons and aid. But Israel also maintains its own nuclear weapons, refuses to discuss them publicly, and develops independent military capabilities that ensure survival even without American support. The Abraham Accords, normalizing relations with UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and potentially Saudi Arabia, create regional partnerships that don't depend on American mediation. These normalization agreements happened with American involvement, but they don't require American maintenance. They're Israeli initiatives that create regional alternatives to complete dependence on American backing. If American support for Israel became uncertain, not impossible given changing American domestic politics, Israel would have regional partners and independent capabilities to maintain security. Poland represents the other side of European hedging. While Germany and France pursue strategic autonomy, Poland deepens military ties with America, requesting permanent American bases and buying American weapon systems. But Poland simultaneously strengthens European defense cooperation and builds bilateral partnerships with other European nations. If American commitment to European defense falters, Poland has European alternatives. If European capabilities prove insufficient, Poland has American backing. This dual-track approach, strengthening both American and European security relationships, represents hedging against different failure modes. Poland doesn't know whether future security threats will find America unwilling to engage or European capabilities insufficient, so Poland prepares for both possibilities. The collective effect of all this hedging is profound. Individually, each ally's actions make sense as prudent risk management. Collectively, they represent systematic reduction of dependence on American leadership and reliability. And this creates a self-reinforcing dynamic. As allies build alternatives, America becomes less central to their security and economic planning. As America becomes less central, allies have less stake in maintaining American leadership. The alliance system doesn't collapse. It gradually becomes less meaningful as actual reliance shifts away from American guarantees. The historical parallel isn't the Cold War, when clear Soviet threat maintained alliance cohesion. It's the interwar period between World War I and II, when British and French security guarantees to smaller European nations proved worthless because Britain and France lacked will to enforce them. Poland had alliance with Britain and France in 1939. Both declared war when Germany invaded Poland. Neither could actually help Poland, which was conquered in weeks. The alliances existed on paper but provided no real security. The interwar parallel is instructive in specific ways. After World War I, Britain and France established alliance networks with Eastern European nations, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, designed to contain Germany and provide regional stability. These weren't minor commitments. They were formal mutual defense treaties with explicit obligations. When Czechoslovakia faced German pressure in 1938, Britain and France had treaty obligations to intervene. They didn't. The Munich Agreement allowed Germany to annex the Sudetenland. The message to all European nations was clear. British and French guarantees were worthless when tested. Poland drew conclusions and tried to prepare independently. Polish leaders knew their alliances with Britain and France might not protect them when crisis came. They attempted to build sufficient military capability to hold against Germany until Western allies could mobilize. But Germany's military superiority was too great. When Germany invaded in September 1939, Poland fought bravely, but was overwhelmed in weeks. Britain and France declared war as their treaty obligations required, but provided no actual military assistance. Poland fell while its allies watched. The lesson contemporary allies draw from this history is straightforward. Formal alliances provide security only if the stronger party is willing to risk war to honor commitments. If that will is uncertain, weaker parties must prepare to defend themselves independently or face conquest. Every ally hedging against American unreliability is applying lessons from Poland's experience in 1939. American allies are preparing for a similar possibility, that American security guarantees might exist formally, but prove unavailable when actually needed. This doesn't require American collapse or withdrawal. It just requires enough uncertainty about American follow-through that allies can't base their entire security on American promises. The trust deficit compounds in specific ways. When Trump questioned NATO commitments, European leaders couldn't simply dismiss this as one president's aberration. They had to consider whether future American leaders might hold similar views. When Biden restored traditional alliance language, European relief was tempered by knowledge that Biden's successor might reverse course again. The inconsistency itself, regardless of which position is correct, makes American commitments unreliable for planning purposes. Allies need predictability to make defense investments, form strategic plans, and conduct foreign policy. If American position on fundamental alliance questions can shift dramatically between administrations, American commitments can't anchor allied planning. Even if America currently supports the alliance, allies must prepare for the possibility that America won't support it in 5 or 10 years. This creates impossible situations for alliance management. NATO's Article 5 commitment requires absolute clarity. An attack on one is an attack on all, automatically, without condition. But if American presidents can question whether they'll honor Article 5, the commitment becomes uncertain. And uncertain commitments are worthless for deterrence. If Russia doesn't know whether America will defend NATO allies, deterrence fails. If NATO allies don't know whether America will come to their defense, they must prepare alternatives. The economic dimension reinforces security concerns. American tariffs on allies, steel and aluminum tariffs on Europe and Canada, threats of auto tariffs, general willingness to use economic coercion against partners, demonstrate that economic relationships with America also can't be assumed stable. If America will impose tariffs on closest allies, citing dubious national security rationales, any economic integration with America creates vulnerability. This drives Canada's diversification, European efforts to reduce dollar dependence in international trade, and Asian nations' pursuit of trade agreements that don't include America. RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership spanning 15 Asian nations, explicitly doesn't include America. Asian nations decided they couldn't wait for American trade leadership and proceeded to integrate their economies without American participation. The technological dimension adds another layer. American restrictions on technology exports, extraterritorial application of American sanctions, and threats to deny market access to companies that work with American competitors all create risks for allied companies and governments. European and Asian allies increasingly view deep integration with American technology ecosystems as creating unacceptable vulnerability to American policy shifts. This drives European investment in independent technology capabilities, semiconductor manufacturing, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and Asian nations' similar investments. China's massive technology development efforts are well known, but European allies are pursuing similar objectives on smaller scale. The goal isn't to surpass American technology, but to have alternatives so that if American technology access becomes conditioned on political compliance, allies aren't defenseless. The sum of these efforts, military hedging, economic diversification, technological independence, represents systematic construction of a world where American preferences are less determinative because allies have alternatives. This doesn't mean American collapse or irrelevance. It means American influence operates differently when allies have options versus when they have none. During the Cold War, Western European allies had no alternatives. Soviet threat was existential. American protection was essential. This gave America enormous influence over Allied policies. In the post-American order emerging now, allies have alternatives, not perfect alternatives, but sufficient to avoid complete dependence on American reliability. The question isn't whether allies will abandon alliances with America. Most won't in foreseeable future. The question is what these alliances mean when allies no longer depend primarily on American commitments. An alliance where partners maintain it out of habit and residual benefit, but have built capabilities to function without it, operates very differently from an alliance where partners depend existentially on American leadership. America faces a choice, though American domestic politics might make the choice impossible. To restore Allied trust would require demonstrating consistent commitment across administrations, accepting that allies have legitimate interests that might differ from American preferences, and providing reliable partnership rather than transactional relationships conditioned on compliance. None of this seems likely in current political environment. One coalition questions whether maintaining global alliances serves American interests. The other coalition supports alliances, but can't guarantee that position will hold when control of government shifts. The result is that regardless of current American policy, allies must prepare for unreliable American commitment. The irony is profound. America built an alliance system that was source of American power and influence for 75 years. But the system required trust, belief that American commitments would hold. Once that trust eroded, the entire architecture becomes less valuable because allies build alternatives. And once alternatives exist, American centrality diminishes regardless of American military or economic power. The allies nobody trusts aren't abandoning America. They're just preparing for the possibility that America might abandon them. And those preparations, undertaken prudently by each ally independently, collectively create the post-American security order, where American guarantees are optional rather than essential. The alliance system may persist formally while becoming hollow practically. Trust is difficult to build and easy to destroy. And once destroyed, it's nearly impossible to restore completely. America's allies are building escape plans because they've learned they might need them.